Welcome to Financial Repression Authority's Roundtable Insight, where the best fund managers, economists, and industry leaders discuss the key investment issues and challenges in the current macroeconomic environment.
Welcome to FRA's Roundtable Insight. This is Richard Bernoulli. Today we have Jeff Snider. He is Head of Global Investment Research for Alhambra Investment Partners. He spearheads the investment research there while providing close contact to Alhambra's client base. And he's also very well published in the industry, nationally at Real Clear Markets, Zero Hedge, Minionville, and Yahoo Finance. And he holds the FINRA Series 65 Investment Advisor license. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, Richard. Happy to be here.
Great. So we have a real special treat. You've provided some slides that will be made available on the website and also in the body of our write-up. They provide some great insight into monetary policy evolution over the last couple of decades. And what you're going to be talking about today is about monetary policy in 2017, how the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates, why they're doing that, and how the whole evolution over the long period of time, the last couple decades, especially since the 1990s, has led to bubbles and overall just economic chaos. So with that, if you want to start, sort of an overview of what you'd like to talk about and getting into the slides.
Yeah, thanks. We have a bit of a contradiction here because the Federal Reserve in 2017 wants to raise interest rates. And I think they've made that very clear that that's what they wanted to do all along for the last couple of years. Yet most people have an understanding or an intuitive sense that the economy hasn't ever recovered from the Great Recession. And so we have this disconnect between what they're doing and the way the world actually seems to be. And there doesn't seem to be a good explanation for why all of this has occurred the way it has. And the reason for it is because the monetary system and the banking system have been drastically changed over the last few decades, especially during the 1990s, the all-important 1990s, that led monetary policy along a different path than the economy and the markets. And so to understand what the Federal Reserve is doing today, you really kind of have to review how monetary policy evolved as the banking and monetary system evolved.
And to begin with, on the first few slides, you've got a quote from 1969.
Yeah, Edwin Dale was a reporter for the New York Times. In early February 1969, he wrote an article that was called "Laughing at the Fed." It was a fairly typical article for Edwin Dale. And Edwin Dale wasn't the typical beat reporter for the New York Times. He was a very well-known, very astute observer of economics and monetary policy. And the article had such an effect that 2 days after it was published, it was actually discussed in the FOMC meeting, the regular policy meeting that followed just after. And in fact, the best part of the story is that Frank Morris, who was the president of the Boston branch of the Federal Reserve, actually took it upon himself, upon reading Edwin Dale's article, and asked various banks in his bank district whether or not they were actually laughing at the Fed, which I think is a pretty good starting point to tell you about, the timeless nature of policymakers, how they typically can be thin-skinned and often probably too self-assured. And furthermore, how that none of the banks actually answered back that they were in fact laughing at him, when in fact you're probably pretty sure that as soon as they hung up the phone with Mr. Morris, that they actually were laughing at him. And that was kind of the period in 1969, just on the cusp of what would become the Great Inflation. And it became the Great Inflation because Edwin Dale was essentially right. The Federal Reserve had no idea what it was doing, even though it sounded like it was in command of every little minute detail. So, it's almost a perfect mirrored start between then and now, because nowadays things are very similar. The Federal Reserve makes a bunch of claims, it does a bunch of things, and nothing ever seems to work. But yet, That's not the way it was. In fact, from 1969, when people were supposedly laughing at the Fed, to 1999, things had changed very drastically. In 1999, of course, Alan Greenspan was considered the maestro. He was essentially probably the most admired central banker in history, maybe outside of Edge, in Bank of England in the 19th century, the father of modern central banking. And so we have to understand how it got that way. How did the Fed in 1969 go from being a joke to by 1999 being perhaps the apex of technocracy?
And as you mentioned, no one was laughing by the late 1990s when Alan Greenspan was the maestro.
Yeah, and it was, if you go back to that time period, if you're old enough to remember the dot-com era, Alan Greenspan was, on Wall Street at least, he was a god. And even to the mainstream media, he was something of a celebrity. I remember people can recall that his briefcase even had its own page on CNN.com when the internet was relatively young, because it was believed that we could tell whether or not the Fed was going to raise rates by what hand he was holding his briefcase. It got to be that kind of almost cultish behavior, because of his reputation, and the reputation that people believe was based on actual conditions.
So what really happened in the 1990s? Can you elaborate?
Well, yeah, there was a lot of disagreement over what happened. I mean, if you were a stock investor, Alan Greenspan was the chief. But even in the academic circles of mainstream orthodox economics, there was quite a bit of doubt. In 2002, for example, James Stock of Harvard and Mark Watson of Princeton delivered a presentation at the annual NBER conference that coined the phrase "the Great Moderation." And what they were doing was trying to figure out where this oasis of low volatility economy actually came from. And they cited several reasons for it. But one of the most intriguing and perhaps the most relevant answer they came up with was what they called just pure good luck. What they meant by that was that during the 15 years up to that point, this is 2002, during that decade and a half of what seemed to be a great moderation, there weren't any of the usual kind of global monetary abnormalities that had plagued economic systems throughout history. From their position inside orthodox economics, especially on the academic side, that seemed to be just good luck, good fortune. When in fact there were other explanations for it that explained a hell of a lot more than just possible luck.
So take us through on some of these initial slides here. You've got total credit market instruments assets, and how does the story develop over the last 2 decades?
One of the things, policymakers themselves, again echoing the 1969 Edwin Bale article, were very much interested in taking credit for the Great Moderation. They wanted everyone to believe, as many people did, that they were in control of the economy, that by increasing or decreasing the federal funds rate a quarter point at a time, they could engineer the so-called Great Moderation. Ben Bernanke actually gave a speech in 2004 where he actually made that claim, that the monetary policy under interest rate targeting actually deserved the credit for the Great Moderation. And it was a view that many people came to adopt, including many in the official academic circles, as well as people inside the Fed. I mean, it was almost a given that monetary policy was perhaps the most powerful thing on earth, and that by controlling the federal funds rate, the Federal Reserve could make everything go. But if you actually go back into the 1990s and review what happened, what you find is just again a radical transformation. The S&L crisis that developed in the late 1980s pertains to what we all think of when we think of a bank. A bank as in, taking in reserves of either cash or hard money, then the money multiplier taking that into levels of loans and deposits, the actual traditional banking system. That wasn't the only part of the banking system at the time, of course, but after 1990, after the S&L crisis, the traditional bank model essentially ended. By the mid-1990s, these new forms of banking and monetary advance had increased and had grown so rapidly that they had surpassed the traditional model in every way, shape, and form. I presented here just one of those possible avenues, which was the issuers of ABS securities, asset-backed securities, the type of off-balance sheet arrangements that nobody really became aware of until 2007 by the time it was too late. These were wholesale financed, very modern vehicles for, not just banking, but securities, all sorts of monetary and money dealing activity. Basically, the whole range of what used to be done under the traditional banking banner was being done more and more under this brand new system that did not operate the same way as a traditional bank. And by 2007, the traditional banking system was a fraction of what it had been even in 1990. So that there was an enormous evolution of banking and even money because of the way these things were funded over the 1990s. In fact, it was Alan Greenspan himself who noticed these kinds of things and mentioned them throughout the 1990s. In fact, I'm sure most people remember in December 1996, Greenspan's irrational exuberance speech. But they remember it for all the wrong reasons. They think about the dot-com bubble and what they think of as a warning. But what he was really saying was that, if you read the speech before he got to irrational exuberance, what he was really saying was that the monetary correlations, the correlation between money growth and various money aggregates in the economy, had gone way off course during the 1980s. Now, he was confident that by targeting just the federal funds rate, that wouldn't matter. In other words, he knew that monetary evolution was taking place. However, he felt that because the federal funds rate was such a hugely powerful control mechanism, it wouldn't matter that the Federal Reserve couldn't even define money. Any normal person in that situation, especially tasked with being the head of the central bank, would probably be unnerved by that. But that was such that his reputation at the time and the conditions of how people perceived the economy, especially in the 1990s. It was a disconnect between what everybody thought he was able to do with the Federal Reserve and what he was actually able to do. And so, if we review monetary policy, the changes in the federal funds rate, especially in the decades of the 2000s, you see this very big difference between what is supposed to happen and what does happen.
And that brings us to the concept of functional monetary policy. You have a chart that sort of begins around 1989 and then goes into the 1990s that depicts accommodative monetary policy sparks credit rebound.
Yeah, and that's what people conceive of what the maestro was doing during the 1990s. He was moving the federal funds rate around, either stimulating or tightening. The famous 1994 bond market massacre when he tightened rates and engineered supposedly the soft landing for the middle 1990s. And there were other minor adjustments in the latter part of the decade. There was a 75 basis point rate cut around 1997, 1998 related to the Asian flu. But overall, what happened throughout the 1990s is people got the idea that there was a correlation between what the Federal Reserve did with nothing more than the federal funds rate in this relatively calm period of economy where it expanded for a decade without any recession. And then in 2001, the recession that did come was only a very mild one, despite the fact that the dot-com bust was an enormous event. And so it really did seem like, on the surface, that monetary policy was a very powerful instrument wielded by the best and brightest that we had to offer. And of course, that really started to go awry with the housing bubble. And really, the housing bubble goes back to 1995. And what we conceive of the housing bubble conventionally is the housing mania portion, which is 2003 forward. And during that period, we really start to see how monetary policy wasn't what people thought it was. And in fact, Greenspan's Fed started to raise the federal funds rate in June of 2004 and kept at it for 17 straight rate cuts, so that by June of 2006, the federal funds rate had gone from 1% to 5.25%, which sounds on the surface like a tremendous amount of monetary policy tightening. But yet when you look around at that time, and you look through all the various statistics, monetary and economic, there was almost no detectable effect from that policy technique. In fact, conditions overall, especially monetarily outside of the traditional monetary statistics, it was actually the opposite. Greenspan intended to tighten, but it was as if the banking system had just simply gone insane in the opposite direction. It was expanding at an exponential parabolic rate in almost every of these wholesale shadow capacities.
And then moving past that into 2007, 2008, as you show on the next slide, the interest rate going down, and then you question, is this accommodative money? Not even close.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's almost an exact mirror image of the rate hike because, during the hiking regime 2004 to 2006, the Greenspan Fed raised the federal funds rate from 1% to 5.25%. And then starting in September 2007, the now Bernanke Fed just reversed it and went from 5.25% back to 1%. Yet during that period where this is supposed to be a hugely accommodative interest rate cut or series of interest rate cuts, you cannot classify that period as accommodative in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it ended up in the first global financial panic since the 1930s. So what are we witnessing here with the federal funds rate? It isn't stimulus when they cut the federal funds rate, just as it wasn't tightening when they raised it. So what is actual functional monetary policy? What we find is that ties directly to the evolution of banking and money throughout the 1990s and before the 1990s, but primarily to the 1990s, how banking had changed from the traditional banking model to this wholesale model, which at the time in 2008 people started to refer to as shadow banks. And the reason we call the shadow banks is because the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and its cousins throughout the globe simply dropped the ball. They stopped caring about actual functional money because they thought the federal funds rate was all they needed to control.
And the next two slides, if you can provide some elaboration from the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, getting into derivatives and how value at risk turns derivatives into currency and dark leverage.
Now, these are the other balance sheet factors that have, at various points in time, acted very much like money themselves. They're very currency-like at times, especially for things like interest rate swaps and credit default swaps. Credit default swaps, people probably remember from AIG and the relation to subprime mortgages. But in fact, the use of a credit default swap was primarily related to balance sheet capital efficiency. In fact, most of the credit default swaps were essentially for primarily European banks to expand their balance sheets without having to raise additional capital. And so what these derivative balance sheet factors, including the gross notional, as I've presented here, tell us is, in general terms, without getting into the complex specifics of each of the derivative formats, bank behavior, whether they're expanding, not necessarily how they're expanding, but how quickly they want to expand. And from that, we can infer how the global monetary system, as it actually was in fact expanding. And, credit default swaps in particular, you look at during the period where Alan Greenspan was raising rates in the mid-2000s, the credit default swap market, at least the total gross notionals of them written and outstanding, paid absolutely no attention to the Federal Reserve whatsoever. And in fact, they increased geometrically throughout that period and for the period after it until the panic period starting in 2007. So the banks that were off in this other shadow world were expanding rapidly all throughout the 1980s and the 1990s and early 2000s. And so we have to consider, was that this so-called good luck impetus that allowed this so-called great moderation to develop? Was it instead how banking was evolving and growing during that period, rather than Alan Greenspan and his 25 basis point rate cuts and rate hikes in the federal funds rate, which was in many ways an irrelevant market?
So what happened into 2016 from the financial crisis that caused the Federal Reserve to quietly surrender, as you quote?
Well, I mean, the fact that the economy never recovered, to put it bluntly and blatantly, despite all expectation. And, to be fair, Federal Reserve officials like Ben Bernanke from the very start said that the recovery would be long and slow, and they did so because they expected the banking irregularities and the bank panic and all that would act as a drag on the recovery as it formed, rather than be a rapid event like it had been in typical recessions. They fully expected that it would be drawn out a little bit longer than maybe people were comfortable with, but that in the end it would be a full recovery. But yet time and again we find that it wasn't ever a full recovery. Every time that the economy was supposed to kick into high gear, into something even close to recovery, it never did. It just didn't. And so, that went on long enough because of the change in monetary behavior through all of these shadow banking and with a really Eurodollar system characteristics. By 2016, the Fed was basically forced to admit defeat. They had tried 4 different QEs that had no success. It didn't create the inflation they thought it would, and therefore if there was no inflation, there was no wage gains, and therefore no recovery. And so they had to basically admit what most other people had finally figured out many years before, that there was never going to be a recovery.
And the next few slides illustrate how the Fed was actually, in fact, destroying potential rather than initiating a recovery.
Well, I don't know if I would say the Fed was destroying potential so much as they were calculating destroyed potential as a consequence of what they still think of as unknown factors. And one of the primary ways that they've arrived at that conclusion is through what's called R star, or the natural rate of interest. The natural rate of interest is something that a Swedish economist, Witzel, had developed in the late 19th century, but lay dormant until the 1990s when academics at Princeton and other places resurrected it. The natural rate of interest is supposed to be useful to monetary policy because it supposedly tells us where employment and inflation balance. In other words, what is the rate on money that won't either spin the economy off into overheating or depress it too much into a depression. And it's not something that's directly observed, so it has to be calculated through various means. And so there's no actual agreement on what R star is. But what economists and policymakers have come to realize is that their calculation of R star since the crisis, since the panic in 2008, has basically arrived at that conclusion that there is no recovery, and furthermore, there isn't one coming. And so when you get to that point, in terms of monetary policy, what that means is there's nothing left for you to do. Monetary policy itself, the FOMC discusses things like the output gap, because that is supposed to tell them where they are in relation to this R star rate, where risks of inflation and deflation are perfectly balanced, where unemployment can be the lowest without risking inflation overheating. And what you find as the so-called recovery developed, time and again they expected this burst of recovery-like growth to occur, and when it didn't happen, they're forced to mark down their estimate of potential GDP or the potential output to match the fact that it never happened. And so over time, year after year, the level of potential just sank and sank and sank, so that by 2016, there was very little distance left between potential and where GDP actually was. And so to Federal Reserve policymakers, what that said is there's no output gap, or very little left. If there's very little output gap left, there's absolutely nothing for monetary policy left to do. Because at a situation where output and the output gap, or at least the level of potential, are the same or nearly the same, stimulus is a waste of time.
So if we look at labor, one of your charts there, what happened to cause a divergence from 2010 up to today in terms of two labor stories?
That gets back to, essentially the mystery of where did the recovery go? And for monetary policymakers at the Fed, and this is a global phenomenon, it's not just a U.S. phenomenon, but specifically with the U.S., the participation problem is that for whatever reasons, a huge chunk of the potential labor force have never re-entered the labor market. They have either never entered during the recovery period, or those that were out of work or thrown out of work in 2008 never went back. And the size of that pool of missing labor is immense. It's as much as perhaps 15 million or more. And so, from the view of monetary policy and the unemployment rate, which figures into the output gap calculation as well, these people don't matter. It's as if the unemployment rate is an actual metric that's appropriate to describing our economic situation as it is today. But if that was the case, as the unemployment rate fell, especially through 2014 and the start of 2015, we should have expected to see inflation start to rise. Instead, obviously, it went the other way. Inflation actually fell due to oil prices and the lack of momentum in the economy. In fact, a slowdown in the economy due to the rising dollar. So you have this very big disconnect between the size of the labor force, which didn't grow, and the fact that the BLS was estimating almost robust job growth. And so over time, what happened is that the Federal Reserve got to the point where they were figuring the unemployment rate described full employment. And because of that and the output gap, they felt they had no choice but to start raising rates, no matter what the economic conditions were at the time. That's why in December 2015, they raised the federal funds rate for the first time, even though the conditions at the time were near recession. In fact, on the day that they had announced that first increase in the middle of December, the Federal Reserve also announced that industrial production had shrank for the first time, which is usually a recession indication. And so you have this striking contrast between what the Fed was doing and what the economy was doing. And it doesn't really make sense, except if you understand both monetary evolution and how monetary policy is actually brought about, essentially. The economy was so poor for so long, the Fed just basically gave up on any kind of stimulus because they essentially said, this is it. This is as good as it will ever get.
And as you mentioned, despite reflation sentiment rampant all over the world, there is still no momentum anywhere, just more of the same recovery, in quotes.
Yeah, and that's usually, it's an unusual occurrence. And, at least in typical historical cycle, when you have any kind of downturn, whether a recession or a near recession, there's usually an upturn that's equal or better. There's usually a symmetry associated with these types of moves. And I think there was the expectation, especially late last year and to start this year, that would be the case. Things were really bad and seemingly, possibly becoming a full recession early last year, and then escaping all that. It should have been the case where the economy here and elsewhere started really improving, meaningfully improving, not just some positive numbers switching off of negative numbers, but actual momentum, very much like we saw at any other point during history. And yet that hasn't happened. Q1 2007 GDP is probably the best example of that recently, where another quarter of hugely disappointing output growth that is actually perfectly consistent instead with the fact that the economy is as it is. Since 2007, it's run at a reduced rate, with very little monetary momentum that will allow for expansion to take hold for what we would know as a recovery. And it's, Richard, it's a global thing.
Yes.
Where you find the same problem in China, in Europe, Japan, Brazil, pretty much anywhere. And so that, again, it points us in the direction of where the global economy can be synchronized like that. the list of suspects that could accomplish such a thing is exceedingly small. In fact, there's only one thing on it. That's the global dollar system. It's the only thing that could, first of all, create such a massive dislocation in 2008 and then make it a permanent thing. The fact that the money system has now functioned pretty steadily and chronically since 2007 tells us a lot about these economic conditions and why, after every time the economy turns lower, it doesn't ever turn back higher again.
In your slides, you also raised the concept of shadow money and how that figures into systemic disruptions. Can you elaborate on that to explain?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of debate about what's driving banks to retreat. And that's essentially the major problem. Before 2007, banks grew, exponentially. They grew as fast as they could. They grew in any way and shape they could, whether it's through mergers or acquisitions, whether it's through a derivative book, money dealing activities, whatever it was. After 2007, banks have done the opposite. Overall, they may not have shrunk, but they aren't growing either. The lack of growth is actually contraction. Some people believe that's because of regulations, where things like Dodd-Frank and Basel III rules have imposed restrictions on especially bank leverage in the post-crisis period. But I'm pretty sure that's not the case. In fact, what changed in 2007 was behavior. The very fact that before 2007, it was thought that there was very little risk to these various kinds of shadow components. No matter what a bank was doing or what it could come up with, there was no risk to it. Even if there was any kind of trouble associated with, a credit default swap book or a repo book, the Federal Reserve, based on the myth of Alan Greenspan as the maestro, would be able to get everyone out of it. And so 2008 and the panic was very instructive in that way, because it showed banks the Fed had no idea what it was doing. Even if it did know what it was doing, it was incapable of solving these problems. And so if you're a bank post-crisis, that's a huge factor in how you set your balance sheet construction, because you can no longer depend on the Fed. And that point was driven home especially hard in 2011, where despite two QEs, where the Fed had expanded the level of bank reserve in the system by 1.6 trillion to the middle of 2011, and yet there was another liquidity event in that year. In fact, it was so bad that in August 2011, the FOMC actually debated an option of bailing out the repo market. So for banks in that position and for banks in that time period, it was a huge wake-up call that these shadow banking activities were enormously risky. In fact, they were so risky that it wasn't worth the effort. It wasn't worth the balance sheet capacity or resources to undertake them, especially given the economic circumstances where at a depressed rate of output here and everywhere else around the world, there was no reward for taking on that risk. And so the risk paradigm shifted, and so did balance sheet capacity shift. And because balance sheet capacity shifted, there is no economic momentum possible.
So do we have a shadow money-driven economic depression?
I believe so. I think it's pretty clear when you step outside of the traditional definitions of money and you marry the evolution of the 1990s to the conditions of today. You see exactly how things evolve. Going back to the idea of the Great Moderation and what they call good luck. If it wasn't ever good luck, as they raised as a possibility at the time, it was due to these external factors, which really weren't external, but were only external to the orthodox view. If it was due to these external monetary factors, then it makes sense. The Great Moderation was a temporary artificial period of calm that was created by monetary growth that was at times explosive growth. Where did the asset bubbles come from? Well, it came from the shadows. And the fact that the shadow system has been nothing but dysfunctional ever since, and so has the economy. That would be one hell of a coincidence, don't you think?
Yeah. And what about like the shadow banking system in China? Do you see problems there?
Yeah, the Chinese system is a little bit different. Their banking system is a little more of the traditional model. That's not to say that a great deal of their growth, especially since 2009, hasn't been in the shadows, because they have clearly tried to replicate the shadow system here. But apparently, they didn't learn any of the lessons from the crisis, and so it had grown enormously. And they're having all sorts of trouble in the Chinese system, in the Chinese version of it, in the very same ways that we had trouble 10 years ago. We have funding mechanisms that are breaking down, creating all sorts of risks that people don't really understand. And unfortunately, that includes policymakers themselves. It's all too easy to simply ignore this stuff when it seems to be working. When things are growing well and it looks like the economy is growing with it, why ask any questions? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And unfortunately, the problem is once it does break, there is no fixing it. And so that's where we are, and I think that's where China's heading, probably in a more managed cycle than we did in 2007, 2008. But ultimately, it's the same thing. Once the contradictions of the monetary system, the shadow system become apparent, there is no going back.
And so given all this historical context, where do we go from here? Do you see a slowing global economy? You've got a few slides in there showing exports out of China slowing down, imports from China to the U.S. slowing down. Could it turn into a stagflation with rising inflation and slowing economic growth, or where do you see things heading in the next year or two?
Well, unless something substantial actually changes, and I don't think the economy substantially changes. We're kind of stuck in this disinflationary depression condition, which here in the U.S. they've called the low growth state, which really isn't that. I mean, the lack of compounding over time is an enormous cost, an enormous contraction in fact. So unless the monetary system is substantially reformed, I don't think this will change. In fact, we know it won't because in many ways the Japanese pioneered this very path 25 years ago. So we are following along the Japanese path far too closely for my comfort. And so, that it's instructive to look at Japan as, unfortunately, what our future could look like. The problem with that is that the global economy is not the Japanese economy. More specifically, the global social and political system, I don't think will stand for 2 decades of absolutely no growth or very little growth to speak. I think we've already seen some of the social and political cohesion coming apart. The votes last year, whether it be for Trump, Brexit, the Italian vote, there's already a great deal of political unrest that's becoming a populist type of, I don't want to say revolution or revolt, but at least a backlash against an economic system that just doesn't work. And so you have to wonder, how long can we go in this current state where it doesn't get better? No matter what happens, no matter what any of the supposed experts tell us to do, nothing will work because the monetary system won't work. And at some point, there has to be a breaking point where either the political system realizes the dangers inherent in that condition and actually responds favorably by taking hold of the Eurodollar system and actually reforming it, rather than trying to just throw another QE into the mix. That's a possible positive outcome. And I don't want to contemplate the possible negative outcomes because some of them are truly the worst kinds of historical comparison.
Wow, that's great insight. Jeff is well known in the industry for his insightful charts, and he's demonstrated it here, taking us through the story of the last few decades on monetary policy and the linkages to the economy. Thank you very much, Jeff. And how can our listeners learn more about your work?
They can find me at our website at alhambrapartners.com in the various syndicated places that some of that you mentioned before.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thanks, Richard, for having me.
The FRA Roundtable Insight Show is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the show each involve their own unique risk factors which are not discussed on the show. Any discussions among the panel participants or responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the panel participants and do not take into consideration the listener's suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Please be advised that you invest or speculate at your own risk.